5 years ago, Bandai launched their very own anime Souls-like game. Despite being the company responsible in some territories for publishing FromSoft's games, they wanted their own. This was Code Vein, and between its release and today, a lot has changed. So in the past month, I spent some time revisiting Code Vein. Developed by Shift, the team behind the God Eater franchise, this was their take on a Souls-like game. In the plainest terms, it's a Souls-like anime game. Code Vein focuses a lot more on giving you a narrative to follow than From's games. FromSoft seems to only like giving you pieces of the story and world directly. Meanwhile, a large chunk of it is environmental and within item descriptions and whatnot. We'll talk more about Code Vein's narrative a little bit later, but the thing I want to focus on first, and the thing that I think matters most in a Souls-like, is the gameplay. Oh my god. When this game came out, I considered it a good first Souls-like game, as this was mine. Funny considering I had not touched a single Souls-like game at the time. I found the game to be challenging enough while not throwing a ton of major hurdles at you. It was pretty easy to dispatch trash mobs, and the game didn't place a lot of hard limitations on how I wanted to play. Yes, there are some here and there, but it's not really that difficult to get around them. Now, about 5 years later, having beaten Elden Ring twice, I can safely say that, yeah, this game is pretty easy. For the most part, much like Elden Ring, this game gives you a lot of easy ways to mitigate the difficult parts. But even factoring that in, I don't think the game is that hard either. Sure, it's a step up from a lot of other games, but that's not really saying much because the state of today's gaming world is that games are pretty accessible and therefore wind up being pretty unchallenging. Going back to it is a little bit weird to grade it and review it, because I'm sure not knowing what these bosses do will catch you off guard. But genuinely, the design of bosses in this game are very simple, and can sometimes be pretty uninteresting. Of the bosses in the base game, I consider 2 of them to be challenging. That said, I didn't need more than 2 tries to beat either of the ones that I believed were challenging the first time I went through. While the game can punish you for spamming dodge and flailing around too much, there isn't much to be said about how the boss fights go. If you're fighting a big guy, chances are you can just stand under him, and more or less you won't be punished. You probably need to play on your feet against more human-sized bosses, but even those fights aren't that tough if you play them right. It's still a good first Souls-like in my opinion, because I guess it teaches you the basics of being careful and learning not to spam your dodge rolls. But I genuinely think if you want a challenge, this game doesn't offer anything that difficult. Like, if you played a Souls-like before, you probably can beat this game without much trouble. Same thing if you've played something like Monster Hunter. This game is not going to be that difficult for you. You're also allowed a traveling companion. These guys do get work done for you. They're not completely useless. Sometimes. If you start to rely on them too much, you'll probably realize how their AI just really isn't that great. Instead of hitting enemies when they're open, they'll stand there and guard, or just pace around. Sometimes, when they're low, they'll just spam dodge when they don't need to, and other times when you need them to share their health, they just won't do it. All that said, these guys do make the game a lot easier. If you decide to venture alone, it won't change the story or anything, but it will make the game harder. I chose not to do this, since although I'm saying the game wasn't hard, I didn't really mind that. It also might be good to leave them behind for some peace and quiet, because some of these guys do not know when to shut up.
Watch where you walk. I hope we find more things we can use. We've been delayed enough. Let's hurry. This is where the fortress should be. I don't sense anyone around. Be careful. Don't worry. If you fall, you can just climb up again. One of Mito's toadies. We're going through.
The game also gives you ample resources to build how you want, and I think that's where this game truly shines. Learning blood codes gives you access to new skills, and once you master those skills by using them and by equipping them, you can use them on any blood code of your choosing. For the most part, there are some skills that are exclusive to certain blood codes. The codes alter your stats and scalings, which in turn also alters what you can wear and use. It's a pretty easy system to get used to. Chances are, if you're going to go a caster class, then you're not going to be able to use a big two-handed sword. And if you go a big two-handed sword class or a tank class, you're not going to have that much MP to use skills. Having the right gear is going to make fights easier, but you can also challenge yourself by trying different builds. For me, I kind of went a standard physical DPS with a sword and a greatsword. This game offers a lot of customization, both in the character creator, which in my experience is one of the best character creators in any existing anime RPG I've played, and in builds. As far as the gameplay goes, it's far from perfect, but it's still really fun. It's not as polished as most Soulslikes or even a lot of games, but as long as you don't hop in expecting it to be the most daunting game you've ever played, I think you'll have a good time with just the gameplay on its own. I wonder what this does. Okay. Well, it didn't do much.
Rejoice on this glorious day of reunion. Praise curiosity in the progress it brings. For you are about to climb the ladder of evolution.
Like I said before, Code Vein really puts a bigger emphasis on story. The narrative itself is good enough. The game sets you up with a lot of questions and not that many answers. A lot of things happen at the beginning of the game, and they're not totally explained until later. Since you're thrown pretty much right into the action, it wastes very little time establishing that you're someone special, as most anime games go if you haven't played any before, and especially games made by the God Eater team. Your main character is usually a silent protagonist who is pretty special in regards to their position. Now, I'm not going to sit here and bore you with a summary of the story or anything like that. That's not my strong suit. But given it's been 5 years since the game's release, I think I can critique it overall. Some parts of this narrative are decently structured, but I can't lie when I say that I don't feel like the story is the most compelling or amazingly top-tier thing in this game. The game wants to focus both on the current conflict and how it connects to your past, and the past of your comrades. It generally wraps up pretty well for the most part, but it's heavily dependent on if you spend your time searching for and restoring the vestiges. In my original playthrough, I found quite a few vestiges, but really didn't go and search for most of them until the end game, or post-game. Which means that while I was able to enjoy the plot, it felt like a lot of questions and world building was just left unsaid. And that is because restoring the vestiges shows you memories of people within the world, and sometimes that includes characters that you know, and sometimes it's characters you don't know at all. But regardless, they are all connected to the characters you know. In a way, it's a way to build the world without having to present you all of these characters, introduce them, and you get to know them. It's very quick, it's very simple, and the presentation's pretty unique. That said, without collecting all the vestiges in my first playthrough 5 years ago, I was not able to view the true ending. So I finally got to view it with my own eyes this time around. Between this and the other two endings that the game presents, the true ending is, in my opinion, definitely the best one. And it leaves the game open to sequels and whatnot, which is obviously something that I've talked about before. To be quick and to the point, I'm happy with this narrative, but it really isn't that groundbreaking or anything. It's fine, but, you know, it's not going to be toppling your top-tier JRPG narratives or anything like that.
The territory up ahead is teeming with the lost. Watch yourself.
Presentation is very important in these games, and Code Vein's presentation is messy. On one hand, it's a good-looking game. The environments and their design feel well thought out. The monster design matches the eerie and drab setting, the characters are all unique looking, but generally where this game kind of falls off is in the little things. For one, there are several combat-heavier cutscenes. Something I've noticed is that it feels like the weapons are very weightless in these scenes, whether that's intentional due to the kind of superhuman nature of Revenants, or just an issue with the animation and the way things are presented in that form, is kind of up to your interpretation. But in combat cutscenes, it feels like the swings lack punch, and that ultimately feeds into my thoughts that these scenes are just not super good looking, or maybe a better way to say it is super good feeling, because the overall action is perfectly fine. But it's that end feel of the swords clashing that just doesn't really feel like it's got any weight to it. There are moments where the voice acting feels like it could have used a little bit more directional improvement, but I think at that point, I feel like I'm nitpicking. And what do you do when you don't have time or money to lip sync your characters? You don't. Code Vein's greatest boon is that the speaking characters are masked almost all the time. The problem is that when they aren't masked inside the base, Sometimes they talk and their mouths don't move. In major cutscenes, this doesn't really happen. I'm pretty sure the mouths are animated in major cutscenes, but in minor cutscenes here and there, they just don't have any lip movement. And that's not an issue as a whole, but it does detract from the immersion of the game a little bit. It's a minor gripe for me, but still something that does bother me a little bit nonetheless. That said, the environments are pretty varied. You have cave systems, big destroyed cities, an underground sewer. You have a church level that makes me want to die. There's a decent variety of locales, and all of them just feel unique. The problem I have is that while some of them are pretty neatly designed, the cathedral is one of my least favorite areas in this game. The color scheme is the same no matter where you go, and I'm sure part of that is intentional, but if you haven't played the game before, there's a good chance you're going to be running in circles for a very long time, because it is so hard to figure out where anything is in this place. Maybe you had less trouble with it than I did, but I just don't like this level at all. If there's a little bit more variety, or if the map was more 3D, it probably would help. And the game gives you a decent idea of where you've gone by showing you little paths that you've walked, but the map itself could probably use a little more detail for this particular area. Most other areas, it's fine. This is really the only one that challenged me navigationally. The rest of the game is pretty straightforward and not that difficult to traverse. Now, like I said before, the game likes to present some of its world building through these vestiges. Your character walks through a bunch of corridors and sees brief statue reactions and voice work of characters from this world. While this is a very unique way to present this information, it's also definitely a this could have been a cutscene kind of moment. Not necessarily an animated cutscene, but even the stone statues could just have a little bit of camera work and the voice work put in there. You don't have to walk your character through all of it. But I do kind of like that stylistic presentation. It feels unique and kind of fun. I know some people get really tired of it, but this is kind of standard, like, anime flashback moment stuff. I don't really hate it, but I think doing too many at once in a row leads to a lot of stuff blurring together, which does make sense. But the music's really nice. I really like the music in these areas. Ultimately, Code Vein has some very creative and unique aspects to its presentation. However, it's cutting corners due to probably budget restrictions or rough area designs. The game feels like it could be so much more than what it is. Perhaps this could be a case of a game getting better with a sequel, assuming a thing like that is going to happen.
All right, that girl is waiting for you.
Overall, looking back at Code Vein is a little weird for me. As a God Eater fan, it's tough to face the facts that it's entirely possible the people who created the franchise I fell in love with might be moving on, especially with how successful Code Vein was in comparison to God Eater 3. And I do know a thing or two about watching my favorite franchise get moved on from, but I'm sure everyone does. But that doesn't make Code Vein bad, and my overall feeling is that I still think this game is good. It feels like, at its core, it's still missing one little piece that would jump over to making it great. It's got good combat, it's got a lot of customization options, a fantastic character creator, and a decent story. But it does have a few presentation issues that bog it down a little bit, and the boss fights are far from the quality you'd see in a Souls-like game. I do look back on Code Vein overall pretty fondly, and tying it into the God Eater series makes it all the more satisfying to me as a God Eater fan. My final message for the base game is to buy it on sale, and, you know, buy God Eater 3 on sale too. Play both of them. They're fun games. While they don't really measure up entirely to the games they're inspired by, I mean, who really can? If you've played it before, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you haven't, maybe give it a shot. It goes on sale pretty cheap fairly often, so might be worth giving it a shot down the line. You know, $8, can't get much better than that. As for the DLC, I may or may not make a separate video for it down the road. I did finish all of it before I completed this run of the game, but I don't really want to cram any more into here because this is a pretty chunky video compared to the stuff I usually put out. So you could leave a like if you want to see that and if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to the channel for more things anime RPG related. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.